Hello and welcome to the Times of India. You're watching Global Pulse with me, Neha Khanna. US President Donald Trump is hell-bent on targeting India with punitive tariffs, irrational arguments and frequent rants. Now, India has hit back and ripped apart the Trump administration's bizarre logic. Before we get to that, let's tell you what China said today. Expressing solidarity with India and hitting out at the United States, the Chinese ambassador to New Delhi has slammed the 50% Trump tariffs imposed on India. Ambassador Xu Feihong said, "It's important not to succumb to pressure as that emboldens the bully." He added, "India and China are partners, not rivals, and will manage their differences through dialogue." Meanwhile, External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar, who is in Moscow today, said India is perplexed at Washington's logic about purchase of Russian oil. During a meeting with his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, Jaishankar said, "We are not the biggest purchasers of Russian oil. That's China. We're not the biggest purchasers of LNG. That's the European Union. We are not the country which has the biggest trade surge with Russia after 2022. I think there are some countries to the south. We are a country where the Americans have said for the last few years that we should do everything to stabilize the world energy market, including buying oil from Russia. Incidentally, we also buy oil from the US and that amount has increased. So honestly, we are very perplexed at the logic of their argument." That's what the External Affairs Minister said. He has also met with Russian President Vladimir Putin at the Kremlin. The United States has slapped 25% tariffs on India, along with an additional 25% levy as punishment for New Delhi's purchases of Russian oil, resulting in a total of 50% tariffs, the highest for any US trading partner. Trump has been putting pressure on India to stop buying oil from Russia, claiming that it is fueling the Ukraine war. But here's what is astounding: the double standards. The US has not imposed any tariffs on China over its Russian oil imports. This despite the fact that Beijing is the largest buyer of Russian energy. And to make matters worse, the arguments being made by members of the Trump cabinet are laughable, to say the least. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has repeatedly justified the hypocrisy of the United States by arguing that India has increased its imports of Russian oil hugely since the war in Ukraine began in 2022, unlike China, which was already buying Russian energy. Bessent has also accused India of profiteering by reselling Russian oil. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio made another genius argument. Of course, we mean utterly stupid. He said India buying Russian oil is adding to Putin's war coffers. However, China buying Russian oil stabilizes the global oil markets. At the start of his press briefing in Moscow, India's foreign minister said today, India and Russia have been the steadiest of the major relationships after World War II. He added that sustaining energy cooperation through trade and investments with Russia is important for New Delhi. He also played up how the defense and military technical cooperation between the two countries remains robust. He said Russia supports India's Make in India goals, including joint production and technology transfer. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov spoke of India-Russia ties in the context of a changing global order. He said, "This is a multipolar system of international relations with an increasing role played by the SCO, BRICS and the G20. Jaishankar is on a 3-day visit to Moscow for an annual bilateral dialogue which will set the stage for Russian President Vladimir Putin's visit to India later this year. And it's not just India and Russia that are strengthening ties amid the American tariff onslaught. India and China too are getting closer as they see the United States as a common adversary. It's another matter that Trump-led United States has singled out India for inexplicably unfair treatment. Earlier this week, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi was in New Delhi. The two countries have decided to reopen border trade, resume direct flight connectivity and facilitate tourist and business visas in addition to setting up a framework to resolve the border dispute. Prime Minister Modi will visit China to attend the SCO summit at the end of this month. It will be his first trip to the neighbouring country in 7 years, and he is expected to hold talks with President Xi Jinping. And even as there is a growing clamour for a greater push to RIC or the Russia-India-China axis, there are many who argue it is time for BRICS nations to come together to jointly fight Trump's bullying tactics. Here's why. India and Brazil have been hit with the highest tariffs at 50% by the Trump administration. South Africa faces 30%. China has already been engaged in a trade war with the US, and Russia stares at the prospect of more sanctions. Even as Trump keeps berating BRICS, calling it an anti-America alliance which he insists is pushing for de-dollarization, ironically, he seems to have become a great unifier for the bloc. Has Trump's tariff terror infused fresh life into BRICS and achieved the opposite of what he had set out to do?
The United States has imposed tariffs of up to 50% on India, and even threatened for more. China firmly opposes it. In the face of such acts, silence or compromise only emboldens the bully. China will firmly stand with India to uphold the multilateral trading system with the World Trade Organization at its core.
Well, I don't want to comment on a person, but let me comment on the subject. We are not the biggest purchasers of Russian oil, that is China. We are not the biggest purchasers of Russian LNG. I'm not sure, but I think that is the European Union. We are not the country which has the biggest trade surge with Russia after 2022. I think there are some countries to the south. We are a country where actually the Americans said for the last few years that we should do everything to stabilize the world energy markets, including buying oil from Russia. Incidentally, we also buy oil from America, and that amount has been increasing. So, quite honestly, we are very perplexed at the logic of the argument that you had referred to.
International relations and architecture that is objectively becoming multipolar, and in which associations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, and the Group of 20 play an increasingly significant role.
सहयोग देने के लिए तैयार है.
All right, let's now go straight across to our guests. Joining me on the show tonight is Seema Sirohi. She's a senior journalist and author. She joins us live from Washington, D.C. Tatiana Kukareva, a senior journalist, joins us live from Moscow. And completing the panel tonight is Dr. Swasti Rao, professor and consulting editor at The Print. A warm welcome to all my guests. Seema Sirohi, let me begin with you. Before we talk about Jaishankar's meeting with President Putin and with his Russian counterpart earlier in the day, let's talk about some very significant statements that have been made this evening by the Chinese ambassador to India. He has expressed solidarity with India, lambasted Trump's 50% tariffs imposed on New Delhi. He says it's important not to succumb to pressure as that emboldens the bully. He then adds that Indian goods are welcome in Chinese markets. Remember, earlier Russia had said if India is finding it difficult to send its products to the US, then they are welcome in Russian markets. And the Chinese ambassador then adds, India and China are partners, not rivals, and will manage their differences through dialogue. All this on a day when Jaishankar is in Moscow. Seema Sirohi, what do you make of these various statements that are coming from different sides and the geopolitical developments that have been rather fast-paced in the last few days? Are we already looking at some major realignments in the face of Trump's tariff onslaught?
Hi. Look, the way everything is unfolding, it's very difficult to say. Obviously, the Chinese ambassador would say what he did. At this moment, China is in the best position vis-a-vis the US, vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis India. I mean, it sits on Indian territory. It has leverage over the Americans with almost complete monopoly on rare earths and critical minerals, as well as supply chains. With Russia, it's in a very strong position to the extent that some people say that Russia has become a junior partner to China. So, of course, Chinese are having a ball. They're going to egg India on, but I'm sure Indian strategists have a very, sane and good head on their shoulders. They're not going to get carried away. There is a realignment taking place in the world thanks to Donald Trump. Everyone's looking everywhere else. But I think the main point is for India, the three big powers, that is the US, China, and Russia, have to first, sort of figure out what their relationships are with each other. And India has to basically be good friends with all, that because India is not in any position to exercise too much leverage. If anything, Indian exports to Russia are like only 1% or so. To Europe, they're 17%. To the US, they're 20%. China, 3%. So, how we don't have much leverage. It's all very difficult to figure out right now. But yes, what India is doing is signaling to the US that it has other friends, mainly Russia. Then a rapprochement with China is useful at this time.
It most certainly is. And clearly, that's the signaling at this point in time by these three countries. Tatiana, if I could bring you into the conversation at this point. We saw the Chinese foreign minister in New Delhi on a 2-day visit. He met with his Indian counterpart as well as Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The Prime Minister is expected to travel to China at the end of the month for the SCO summit. We believe President Putin will attend in person as well. And then, of course, Jaishankar traveling to Moscow to meet his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, and later in the day, he met with the Russian president. What do you make of these various fast-paced geopolitical developments and critical engagements that are taking place in the clear backdrop of Trump's tariffs that have really unleashed some sort of a terror on the entire world, not to mention with India being singled out?
Well, Neha, I think the message behind every single thing that you listed is loud and clear. BRICS countries are taking a stand. They have been taking a stand against the, first of all, US exceptionalism that has ruled basically every single decision in American foreign policy for as long as I can remember. In the meantime, with Donald Trump playing the game that he's been playing with these tariffs, the negotiation tactics that he's basically had throughout his whole career, I'm actually at a shock that people are still surprised when he plays this game, of saying something outrageous so that the next thing he says seems very reasonable. He's written a book about it, everybody's read it, and yet we're still surprised to this day. But I believe that, with the policy that the BRICS leaders have been pursuing, the, de-dollarization of trade between BRICS nations to begin with, has been very much, first of all, it has been successful, as we can see from the numbers, but also, it's a very, very clear message to the US and to Donald Trump at this moment that, this, again, just as the foreign minister has said, this is a multipolar world. And there is no way of escaping the multipolarity at this moment in time.
Tatiana, before I take this to Dr. Swasti Rao, I know you have to leave, so I'm going to ask you a follow-up question before we let you go. We, of course, heard what External Affairs Minister Jaishankar said today, saying India is completely perplexed at the logic of the United States. Frankly, we've heard some of the most bizarre and illogical statements coming from Trump's cabinet in the last few days as they try and justify the punitive tariffs on India and singling it out. But let me ask you this question. While there are many who say that, Trump, ironically, has infused fresh life into BRICS, there are many who are now also saying that RIC, the Russia, India, China axis, is an idea whose time has come. How would you look at that?
Well, first, Neha, let's remember that Donald Trump and his administration, as an extension of him personally, thrive on chaos. The statements that he makes, it's a political game. It has been from the very beginning. But yes, the biggest problem with this logic and the game that he has been playing is always with the same thing. It's about him not remembering that he plays with different nations, and different nations have different mentalities. So it doesn't always play in his favor. I think the fact that Donald Trump, maybe not so much, him personally, but generally, American leaders tend to forget that not all countries are Europe. Not all countries are, European states, smaller states that are completely dependent on the US. And his behavior, in this case, Trump's behavior, but generally American leaders' behavior, it doesn't change, when they deal with bigger nations. I think that what he's doing right now, with the fact that he doesn't change his strategy when it comes to bigger states, more powerful states like India, like China, obviously like Russia, it does play in the favor of BRICS as a concept, and of the relationship between Russia, China, and India to, as a smaller group.
Right. A final question to you, Tatiana. The White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, said the other day, President Trump has imposed punitive tariffs on India, hoping that he can put pressure on President Putin to end the war in Ukraine. And frankly, we've not heard anything more preposterous than this in a very long time. Trump is imposing tariffs on India, hoping that Putin will bring an end to the war in Ukraine?
I think, Neha, it's been long overdue that we stop taking what Trump says through his press secretary or directly through his social network at face value. It's not about what he says. It's mainly about what he does. Let's first remember that the tariffs were imposed, if I'm not mistaken, with a 21 days, addendum to react and to start a negotiation, which is essentially what he's going for. He usually does this in order to induce further talks, in order to then get to something that he really wants. It's never about the first kind of buy and ask. The first ask is always it seems completely crazy, but it's not, because it's not about what he says, it's about what he wants in the long term. And obviously it's not about who's the bigger buyer of Russian anything, It's not about taking Russian oil off the market, so to speak, to begin with. It's about putting more American oil on the market, more American liquefied gas on the market. It is about forcing other countries to not necessarily stop buying Russian oil. I don't believe that Donald Trump, having spent so many years in big business, has absolutely no understanding of the markets. The markets are very kind of logical. You take a big chunk of something out of the market, the prices for everything else go up. So he doesn't want that. He just wants for the American piece of the pie to be bigger, to put it in simple terms.
Yes.
So I think the biggest takeaway from this is that we need to stop listening to what Donald Trump says and start looking more closely at what he does. Everybody's seen Vladimir Putin arriving at Alaska.
Exactly.
Exactly the pictures that you're showing right now. This doesn't look like the cold welcome, of a completely isolated state, which is what we've been talking about this whole time. Russia is so terribly isolated, and yet the two leaders are there. They're both smiling. They're both quite friendly. And that, to me, as a journalist and as a person, is worth 1,000 billion words,
Oh, yes. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more with you. And the biggest irony of it all, really, is that he is punishing India for doing business with Russia at a time when it is Trump who decided to roll out the red carpet for Putin and received him with applause, no less, in Alaska. We'll leave it there, Tatiana. All right, very quickly, complete your point.
Let's be honest, very quickly, America is doing business with Russia, and India is going to continue doing business with Russia. So again, it's exactly the opposite. It's not about India not doing business with Russia. It's just simply about him wanting to sell more to India, but just going about it in his very unique and special way. Let's call it that.
Which is really the way of a schoolyard bully, many would say. Tatiana, thanks so much for joining me on Global Pulse tonight.
Thank you.
Okay, let me take this to Dr. Swasti Rao now. Dr. Swasti Rao, we've talked about what the Chinese ambassador to India said earlier this evening. Let's now focus on what External Affairs Minister Jaishankar said during his bilateral meeting with Sergei Lavrov. He made some very interesting points, and he really seems to have ripped apart the logic presented by the Trump administration to explain the punitive tariffs on India. He says, we're completely perplexed at this logic because we're certainly not the biggest purchasers of Russian oil. We're certainly not the largest buyer of Russian gas. And it is the United States of America that had actually encouraged us to buy Russian oil at the start of this war in order to stabilize international oil markets. And therefore, we do not understand what really is going on now. And that brings me back to the point that Tatiana made there. Of course, it's impossible to take Donald Trump at face value. Like I said, none of the arguments made by his administration add up. So is this really about trade? Is this about Russian oil? Is it about Trump being pissed off with India because we denied him credit for the ceasefire between India and Pakistan? Is this about Trump forcing the rest of the world to buy more of American energy? What's at play here?
Okay. Good evening, Neha, and thanks for having me over for the show. And it's always such a pleasure to hear, Seema, who I really hold in very high regard. I mean, she's one of the best that we have who writes on India-US relationship. So anyway, glad to be with all of you. And Tatiana has left, so my regards to her as well. Now, you see, Dr. Jaishankar, when he says that he was perplexed at America's behavior, I think that very thing should tell us, more as scholars and analysts and researchers of international relations, that it's time for India to be more, strategically realistic. One needs to understand that this is not about, as you said, Trump seems to be upset with India, and especially the Indian, Prime Minister, for not giving him the credit for bringing or facilitating. That is something which has been, that ship has sailed. I do not know what the Prime Minister's office is planning to do about that. But for sure, it doesn't take a genius to understand that this is not really about Russian oil per se, because you keep getting all kinds of contradictory statements and behavior from Donald Trump administration. And, the panelists before have alluded to it and elaborated upon it. So I'm just going to be repeating. Now, coming and bringing it back to India, Neha, what I see here is that India's behavior right now, I mean, we have to make a distinction between the optics and India's interests. Now, it is very clear that India has to show, and Seema also said it beautifully. She said that we have to show that, yes, we are not alone in this world. So you obviously cannot take us for granted, and India must stand up to bullies, because that's how bullies need to be treated. That's first. And Donald Trump is a bully. There's no denying the fact. I see from a scholar's lens, when I see what India is doing, I see that India is literally classically hedging its best bets. Hedging is defined as an insurance seeking behavior with at least two or three attributes, generally in IR theory. One is that it refuses to take sides. Second is that it pursues sometimes opposite and sometimes mutually counteracting measures. And this is done, why? To offset multiple risks. And sometimes there is a third attribute, which is that the state aspires to diversify and cultivate a fallback position. So when you see India reaching out, it is basically, and simplifying this language, I would say India is simply diversifying and India is hedging its bets, which is the right thing to do. Now, that's the first part. The second part is when we sit here and criticize Donald Trump, I think what we need to also understand is that when you look at what the 213 days of Trump into the White House have done for the Americans, why do you see that he gets away with what he does? Nobody in their right minds would be able to get away with what Donald Trump is able to get away, which is that he has been able to make America's GDP in the last 200 days alone grow at 3.0%. In the second quarter, the unemployment rate in the US is about 4.2%, and the S&P 500 is up by 5.7% since he took office. And that is the reason why he's able to sell this nonsense back to his MAGA fan base so successfully, not really caring about others. The third point I want to mention is about leverage. And we must understand that India should be realistic about what leverage India has. And therefore, the need of the hour, apart from diversifying and apart from sort of hedging our bets, is also to look inward. We have to really look into the reasons why our manufacturing remains at a 13% of our GDP. And there is one thing that nobody is talking about, which is that why have we suddenly started to imagine the world in terms of a G3, which is the US and China and Russia? I mean, India has excellent relations with so many middle order countries. There is the ASEAN grouping, there is Japan, there is the EU, there is the whole Middle Eastern bloc, there's UAE, Saudi Arabia, there's a whole host of countries that we should be doubling down our engagements with. And those are relationships that are going to help India in the longer term. And finally, I have something to say about China and this entire thing about RIC and everything. 90s, it really made sense for China, India, and Russia to stick together in the Eurasian, equation back then. What has happened now is that India is no longer equidistant between Russia, US, and China. Please understand that. And there is no denying the fact that India and China have structural foundational issues, which are not just about talking to each other or Wang Yi coming here. Wang Yi has left here. He's now in Kabul and he's having a trilateral, the sixth iteration of this trilateral between China, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. The previous iteration happened merely a month after the Pahalgam attack. And you please remember that our armed forces have gone on record saying that the kind of that China provided to Pakistan against India is something it is for us to analyze. So long and short, the point that I wish to reiterate is that it makes all the sense in the world today for India to manage its relationship with China at a time when the world order is so uncertain and fluid, and with somebody like a Donald Trump who is a disruptor. In fact, Donald Trump today is the chief disruptor of everything that we regard as global order. There's no denying that. So it
Yes,
makes
I
sense for
agree.
it to manage its
The
relationship with China. Yes,
Yes,
and
the
that is
man
what.
is not just a disruptor. I think you're quite right in describing him as a disruptor, and he really seems to be upending the international order as we know it. Let me take this back to Seema Serohi. Seema, two questions for you. Number one, a lot of us have been scratching our heads for weeks now, trying to figure out what's going on with Donald Trump and what his primary motivation might be behind singling India out for these punishing tariffs. Many believe it could be personal pique against India and Prime Minister Modi. Then there is, this talk about how he's using these bullying tactics to extract greater concessions from India as part of the trade deal negotiations, which seem to be stalled at the moment. I wonder, what your take is on what is driving Donald Trump's animosity and sudden hostility towards India, because his recent actions really have taken the India-US relationship perhaps to its lowest point in 3 decades. My second question to you is, as Swasti very rightly pointed out there, even as we look to tango with China, we cannot lose sight of the fact that this is a country that we have a very fraught history and relationship with. Memories of Galwan are still fresh. There may have been a rapprochement in the last few days, but we all know that China played an important role in its support of Pakistan during Operation Sindoor just months ago. How does India reconcile these two realities in these very uncertain and tricky times?
Okay, first, let me agree with everything Dr. Rao said. Leave optics aside. Much of what countries do is sometimes aimed at domestic audiences, sometimes to signal other countries. In terms of Trump, what drives him to have crashed the US-India relationship, I would say it's a combination of factors. First, he didn't get the trade deal quickly enough of a kind that he wanted, which is, where he could say, I opened up India, I can sell anything to India. This is like another thing on his checklist. Didn't happen soon enough. Talks had been going on since February or whatever, since the Prime Minister came here. Number two, then came Operation Sindoor. And that, I think, really was a personal issue for him. And he took umbrage, and that has driven this very kind of personal attack, which all his cabinet colleagues are sort of magnifying, because everybody in this administration does what the boss says. As I've said many times on many shows, policy is being made top down, not bottom up. There is no process here. Whatever Trump says goes, and whether it's the Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, happened to be one person, Marco Rubio, or the Treasury Secretary, they will fashion whatever they say to suit what Trump has said and justify it, try to find, bizarre points pull out bizarre points. So now Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, is out to sort of attack Indian refiners, in refiners of Russian oil. And we know where the finger is pointing. He's channeling the former trade representative Robert Lighthizer, who wrote a book about negotiating with India. He was then Trump 1.0. And he sort of zeroed in that Indian economic policies run by 6 or 7 business families, etc. All that has carried over, that kind of thinking. So it's very difficult to say what exactly, but I would say trade, lack of a trade deal, and personal umbrage, insult that how Prime Minister Modi did not agree that Trump made the ceasefire happen. And add to that the multiple lobbyists of Pakistan, Qatar, and they even other Arab countries whom we think of as very good friends, many of them did not like the, India's action after Pahalgam. They may not say it openly. They all condemn the terrorist attack, but nobody approved of India's attack during Operation Sindoor. So all these lobbyists, some of them have Trump's ear, some of them have Susie Wiles, the White House Chief of Staff, who's a very powerful entity in this administration. Some of them have her ear. And currently, India doesn't have anybody who can speak with authority to the president directly. That is one big problem. So that's where I'd leave it.
Absolutely. And I put another question to you, Seema. Sorry for clubbing those questions together, but appreciate your comprehensive answer. My second question was about the tango with, between the dragon and the elephant. Maybe that is the need of the hour. We all welcome the statement signaling the rapprochement between New Delhi and Beijing that have come out in the last few days. But how do you reconcile that with the fact that there is still this deep mistrust between the two countries? It's not just about the border dispute. It's not just about what happened in 2020 in the Galwan Valley, but as Dr. Swasti Rao pointed out, also China's active role in supporting Pakistan during Operation Sindoor.
China is maximizing its advantage vis-a-vis India right now. And it's so obvious, like Dr. Rao pointed out, where did Wang Yi go after New Delhi? Where did he go? He went to have a dialogue with the Pakistanis and the Afghans. He's had a dialogue with Bangladesh, Pakistan, and China. That also has happened. So, and don't forget, decades of friendship and cooperation and nexus between Pakistan and China. China is indeed responsible for Pakistan's success in delivery of nuclear weapons and design of nuclear warheads. So who are we fooling? I mean, I'm sure India knows this. Of course, India knows this. Of course, the External Affairs Minister knows this. This is happening because India is under pressure from the US, and it has to show that it has other friends. The question uppermost in my mind is for China to say everything like, don't get bullied. Yeah, fine, of course. Who wants to get bullied? That's the most obvious thing to say. But what is China seeking in return? Is China giving anything to India? India has a huge trade deficit with China, double what Trump has with India, for which he's putting pressure on India. So all these are facts we have to keep in mind. It's good that India is able to play these cards, and hopefully someone in Washington will notice. I'm not very optimistic on that front because Trump has his own game plan with China. This is the problem. If he makes a deal with China, he makes a deal on Ukraine-Russia war and makes a peace agreement happen, where does it leave India? That is the biggest question in my mind. Because so far, he is kind of succeeding. As Dr. Rao pointed out, he has managed to bully everyone to come to him. I mean, look at the European. They cut a deal with him on trade. They came running here to the White House, sat in front of him. He was lord and master in a manner of speaking, in terms of optics. So he gave due respect to Putin in Anchorage, Alaska, to make him feel that, yes, he's not driven by the typical Washington mindset of anti-Russia sentiment, and he has an open mind. He's upset with previous administration for driving Russia into the arms of China. So he wants to break that. So these are like very grand, big designs he has. I wouldn't dismiss him as, maverick, or I think there is some sort of a big plan in his head. Over to you.
Okay, actually, brave of you to give so much credit to Donald Trump, because there are a lot of people who seem to think there is no method to the man's madness. Okay, it's interesting. You believe there might be a larger and some sort of grand design behind all of this. You say he does not want to push Russia further into China's embrace, but ironically, he seems to definitely be pushing India closer to both Russia and China. And it's bizarre and ironical because he claims to be punishing India for doing business with Russia. Therefore, clearly the tariffs are proving to be counterproductive in that sense. And let's not forget that for a long time now, many Americans have believed that India would be the perfect counterweight to China. But clearly, Trump doesn't seem to believe in that or care about that, or again, there's nobody really advising him on that. We don't know which of these it is. Before I take this back to Dr. Swasti Rao, I just want to quote what Trump's fellow Republican, Nikki Haley, a former US ambassador to the UN, has said. She says, to achieve the Trump administration's foreign policy goals, outcompeting China and achieving peace through strength, few objectives are more critical than getting US-India relations back on track. So, Dr. Swasti Rao, let me ask you this. Clearly, Donald Trump is not listening to us. We can only hope that he will listen to somebody like a Nikki Haley. But I found what, Seema Sirohi said a while ago absolutely fascinating. She says, there aren't enough people in Washington who have the ear of Donald Trump and his close aides. And I have had quite a few guests on this show tell me that they believe that there is a degree of India illiteracy in the corridors of power in Washington, D.C. That as far as lobbying goes, Pakistan has far and greatly outdone India on Capitol Hill. What explains this? I mean, forget that we're the largest democracy in the world, but, we are this emerging regional and global power. We're the fourth largest economy in the world. How is it that despite all its economic and foreign policy heft, India has managed to be outdone by Pakistan as far as lobbying on Capitol Hill is concerned? It beats me.
Yeah. No, it beats everybody, Neha. And I think if the causality was so easy to determine, I think you would have already arrived at certain explanations. So I think any serious scholar worth their salt would come and say that it is perplexing and we do not understand what the real causality there is. Of course, it seems to be a combination of factors. So many of them have been discussed here on the show itself. And one part you mentioned that there doesn't seem to be, India not being successful with lobbying rightly. Now, having said that, I mean, I'll just add a couple of things before I sort of answer your question, because I was like really interested in what Seema and the way she was elaborating, upon how we have to keep in mind the larger equation, etc. See, when it comes to Pakistan, the thing that we do not study enough in India is that Pakistan in the decades actually after the American administration stopped, sending weapons to them, especially after their, repivot, etc. So what has happened is that China has become their topmost weapon supplier. and the number two defense supplier to Pakistan today is Turkey. Now, the thing that we need to also understand better, and well, this is of course now gaining ground after Operation Sindoor, which is that in that particular decade, what Pakistan has done is that it has made itself rather indispensable to the defense industries of both China and Turkey. Okay, so today you have a situation where China and Pakistani co-produced jets are being sold in Azerbaijan that have Turkish missiles on them. Okay, so that is also something that we need to keep in mind, that the defense industry value chains aren't as simple as they used to be. So it is not just about one big weapon supplier there, US, or the other one called Russia. There is a emergence of middle order defense value chains that cross cut, and this could be played against India's interest. And this is going, taking this complexity a little bit further. So I just wanted to add to that. And now coming back to, lobbying, etc. It is true that Pakistan, ever since it started, it has been able to garner more international, support generally by and large. This has also come at a time when our multi-party, teams were traveling all over the world in order to tell everybody Pakistan's complicity in the terror attack. And we just saw that none of that really worked. And what we instead saw, that a CENTCOM commander-in-chief is now endorsing, Asim Munir. He's having lunch with the US. But having said that, I think that is where we need to sort of distinguish between the optics and the strategic realism that I was earlier mentioning. Because, see, Neha, end of the day, you need to understand that there is also a limit to what kind of endorsement. See, Pakistan is actually making while the sun shines, okay? Just as China to this making hay while the sun shines, because China is heavily invested in Pakistan economically, militarily, defense industry wise, and it is not going to be such a cakewalk for US to now just, remove China suddenly and emerge and take its position back. So I don't see any weapons coming from the United States. I don't think Trump has done that. I don't see, apart from this very vague minerals deal that he has, he's having minerals deal with everybody. I think out of 200 countries, he probably, if he had his way, he would have a minerals deal with 300 countries. I mean, that's the way Donald Trump operates. He just cuts a deal and he wants to, get all the credit. So I think we have to also somewhere keep in mind that this US-Pakistan bonhomie that we see has definitely come at the cost of India, but at the same time, there are certain limits to it, and we should be very rooted in strategic realism in order to understand how far will it go. That's the first thing. The second thing, like I said, that whenever a great power, or let's say a strong power, a solid power, is not merely defined by the parameters of its success or its global footprint. It is also defined by the parameters of realism and the realistic thinking that it should do in order to realize its limitations. I do agree that part of the reason is because we do not figure any more in Donald Trump's strategic calculus. Now, whether we will start figuring again, because please let's not forget that remember the early months of Donald Trump being in office, everybody was talking about how the Quad is going to be the centerpiece of his foreign policy in order to counter the rising influence of China and everything in the Indo-Pacific. So we have to be patient, we have to be realistic, we have to stand tall and really work out our own problems. And one of the things is that why is it that we have not been able to make we have not been able to benefit from the China plus one diversification? Why is it that the investments that were ready to come to India did not land in India but landed elsewhere? So, it is always very useful to always have that internal eye open and see what is it that we can do. The China rapprochement is happening because we need to manage this relationship. We know that Pakistan is itching to come at India again. I mean, it is an unfinished war. This is what the assessment has been by so many people, and I totally agree when other scholars argue that this Operation Sindoor is an unfinished business. Pakistan would be itching, to come, at India, knowing that today India is isolated, and it is Pakistan that is being endorsed by China, by the United States, by the Gulf states, etc., etc.
Yes.
So this is something that to keep in mind. And what you are seeing with China has to be looked upon with that lens and not with a kind of a strategic reset or a paradigm shift in terms of suddenly Hindi Chini bhai bhai ka daur wapas aa gaya. It is
Yeah,
ridiculous,
I
you know.
think
I mean,
we
that
need
is
to tread cautiously here and cannot get carried away. It's really not Hindi chini bhai bhai anymore. I think it's just pragmatism that you're witnessing right now, given the very very delicate situation that we find ourselves in. Seema Sirohi, I will give you the last word, and I have to ask you this. We all know Trump is a very transactional man. Even though we're completely sort of stunned to see his love fest with Pakistan and Asim Munir, but many say that is driven by the Trump family's investment in Pakistan's crypto council. Of course, Trump has also talked about suddenly discovering major oil reserves in Pakistan, which I think even the Pakistanis were not aware of, and rare earth deposits. We've seen him feting Asim Munir at the White House, treating him as a state guest, and this came just months after the Pahalgam terror attack. But my question is a larger one. Taking off from what you said earlier, explain to me, because I cannot understand for the life of me, how is it that Pakistan manages to play Trump and the United States so deftly, so skillfully, and how is it that they're beating India at this game? Till just the other day, we were talking about how the India-US partnership is the most important strategic partnership of the 21st century. In fact, these are not even my words. These are the words of Joe Biden, Trump's predecessor. And now look where the India-US relationship is. How is it that we do not have enough think tanks, enough lobbyists, enough people, in Washington, D.C., on Capitol Hill, talking to Donald Trump and people close to him? How is it that we're not able to drive home the point that America needs the India, that India is bloody important and it needs to figure in Trump's strategic calculus?
Well, this big question would be better answered by someone in Delhi. Clearly, India didn't have its ear to the ground. Clearly, India was overconfident about reading Trump 2.0. And clearly, Pakistan read 2.0 better than New Delhi. These are very obvious facts. And Pakistan was at it from last year. Okay, they started, once they realized that Trump might win, they started focusing on what he wants and what drives him, what turns him. So they figured it out. It was crypto, which was very obvious. If you were reading the New York Times on a regular basis, you would know, or more newspapers, you would know that. So they started acting accordingly. They deployed this British Pakistani guy who's now their minister for crypto, and he's very well connected, some key Pakistani Americans, etc. India maybe failed to do all that. I mean, this is, we are at a point where even the big CEOs of American companies that have big investments in India are not speaking up, right? Whereas Trump goes about destroying a very important relationship. So that's one. It's just basics, they had better lobbies. They've deployed like 14 lobbies. Plus, Qatar's lobbyists are also helping Pakistan, I'm told. Number two, there is a structural issue. I know sitting in New Delhi and even to the proponents of India-US relations, it feels that the relationship was truly consequential. truly, all the flowery big words that the joint statements would always repeat, turns out India is kind of in the next order of importance. As I said before, the big three are important. Um, then it's like the Middle East, Israel, countries like that. So it's like we have to recognize that in order to create leverage, India has to do something different. Uh, as one White House official told me, that if India stopped trading, the world will not stop. But if China stopped trading, the world will stop, as it did with critical minerals. When Xi Jinping put a block, when Trump came with the bang and introduced 145% tariffs on China, etc., China immediately took action because it had leverage. So these are the harsh realities. We sometimes drink our own Kool-Aid or whatever, and don't have the hard eye on the reality. Reality is much harsher than joint statements. I mean, I would hesitate, even be afraid to ask what's happening to the GE engine deal that was signed during Biden administration. Where is all of the other bilateral stuff, defense cooperation? I mean, it's so bad right now in Washington vis-a-vis India. So I'm even afraid to try to find out.
It really is bad, isn't it? I don't think any US president has done more damage to the India-US relationship in the last 3 decades than Donald Trump has. A relationship that's been painstakingly built with bipartisan support on both sides. I guess the biggest crime that India committed was not to bow and kowtow to the emperor and kiss the ring, because we choose to assert our strategic autonomy. And now many countries are, of course, talking about standing up to the bully and doing it together. On that note, Seema Sirohi and Swasti Rao, it's been an absolute pleasure having both of you on the show. Thank you for your time and perspective.
Thank you.
All right then, as we said, it's been a very important day with India's foreign minister meeting with his Russian counterpart in Moscow, and then also with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The Chinese ambassador to India has come out in support of India, condemning the Trump tariffs imposed on New Delhi. So where is this equation going? That remains a very important question at the moment, at a time when clearly the world is reeling under the terror of Trump tariffs. Thanks so much for joining me on Global Pulse.